Good afternoon, everyone who has joined us on this afternoon for this important discussion on renaming places and spaces at UCT. On behalf of the Development and Alumni Department, a warm welcome to you all from a coldish Cape Town. Thanks for joining us for this, as I said, important discussion, which takes place obviously within the context of the university's Vision 2030 and our sort of exciting journey on reimagining UCT, not only about renaming places and spaces, but all our activities. So a very, very warm welcome. For those who don't know me, I'm Sydney van Heerden, the Acting Executive Director of the Development and Alumni Department. So on behalf of my department and the university, a warm welcome to you all. We are very privileged to have with us this afternoon our Vice Chancellor, Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, who will be speaking first and talking to us. And then also joining us on the panel, our Chief Operations Officer, Professor Rino Morar, our Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research, Professor Stu Harrison, our Deputy Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning, Associate Professor Liz Lange, and then also our Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor for Transformation, Professor Martin Hall. And also welcome to Malcolm Campbell from the Chair of the Namings of Buildings Committee at UCT. As I said, welcome to you all. We're going to kick off and I'll go straight to the Vice Chancellor to talk to us, and we'll try and answer all your questions. I have to just mention that you can post your questions in the chat column, in the chat box, and we as a panel would try to respond to those as best we can during the session. So please kindly post your questions in the chat box. And with that, I'll hand over to the Vice Chancellor to sort of kickstart our discussion this afternoon. Thank you, Vice Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Sydney. And thank you very much to everyone who's in the room. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. As Sydney explained, I'm joined today by members of the UCT Executive, Professor Sue Harrison, Associate Professor Liz Lange, Emeritus Professor Martin Hall, Dr. Reno Mora, and as well as Mr. Malcolm Campbell, who will join us. He's the chair of the Naming of Buildings Committee. I thought to start today by saying to you that we called this meeting to talk about renaming of places and spaces. I know that there's a matter on the table at the moment, and it's the matter of the renaming of Smart Hall. But I thought rather than just looking at Smart Hall, we should look at what brought us to changing the name or to the proposal of the name change for Smart Hall. And that's looking holistically at renaming and of places and spaces. Because looking at this issue in that way helps us to respond to the questions not only of smarts, but to thinking ahead about how this process happens. How can you, as members, important members of our community, contribute to the conversation so that you don't come in late? How does the process unfold at the Naming of Buildings Committee, and who's in charge and how decisions are made? I think it's a much better way to attend to this because it helps us be proactive about what's coming up rather than just react to what's happened. Of course, the Naming of Buildings Committee is a committee of council, and it is responsible for establishing and maintaining a register of names given by council to buildings, to spaces, rooms, and lecture theatres on campus, and promoting an awareness of the reasons behind the names among staff and student members of the university. The committee is also responsible for making recommendations for naming or renaming of any building, space, room, or lecture theatre on the campus with full motivation in each case. Of course, The Vice-Chancellor, together with the executive assisting her, leads the university, ensures that the university succeeds as an academic institution, and we ensure also we are an inclusive community of diverse voices, but we can share values and honor our different histories. Even though we have that responsibility as the executive team of the university, it is in fact the Naming of Buildings Committee that presents proposals to council for specific buildings to be named or renamed. The Naming of Buildings Committee is a representative committee. It is chaired by a member of council who's nominated by council, and it includes one of you, a member of convocation, nominated by the Alumni Association Advisory Board, which is currently led by Diana Yach. So that this community has got one representative on the committee, the Naming of Buildings Committee. That said, we as the university leadership recognize that the naming of buildings is an important process. We don't take it lightly. These names that we have for buildings and spaces need to reflect the values of the many different groups that make up the UCT community, including students, staff members, alumni, and other stakeholders. And this community is hugely diverse. It has become even more diverse as the university has grown after '94, and even as the university has grown in recent years beyond 2000. It is a much bigger community. And we want the university to reflect the values of those many different groups in our community. For this reason, the process of naming and renaming buildings does not happen quickly. In fact, when council decided to change the name of the Jameson Memorial Hall, for example, in June 2016, that was the start of a discussion that lasted a year and a half. And this is just an example of how long it can take to decide that the name of a building must change, to come up with a new name, and finally gets approved and it goes up. So it was not until December 2018 that we could announce that we would honor the memory of co-heroine Sarah Bartman, who is a potent symbol of the new campus community we are committed to building. It is important that we consider how naming a building can help us create a sense of community at UCT and even across South Africa, because UCT belongs to all of us South Africans, those who studied at UCT, those who didn't study at UCT, and in fact, future generations who will come to study at UCT. It is South Africa's jewel. UCT is committed to pursuing a future that includes our different histories, our cultures and aspirations, as well as the values we want to build for future generations. And so in this sense, renaming a building allows us to respond to both the past and the future of UCT and to reflect our diversity and inclusivity. Of course, our past is an interesting thing to consider, because we have a very, very complex past as a country. As I always say, we have legacies that make us proud. We've got legacies that we are not so proud of. We've got legacies that are complex. They've got moments of pride, moments of shame. And we've got legacies that bring us together as a nation. But we've got legacies that actually pull us apart. And so when we look at our past, when we want to take the process of renaming a building and use it to respond to both the past and the future of UCT, it is not an easy task at all. And so this conversation today is an opportunity for us to perhaps engage or consider why one particular building should not have been renamed or not. It is not that opportunity, but it is also not an opportunity for us to argue for which buildings have to be renamed and present arguments here, because we are not the Naming of Buildings Committee. My hope with this conversation is that we can go beyond talking about just one building, but we can consider laying the groundwork for a wise policy that will guide future generations at UCT. We need to keep our eye on the legacy we will pass on to those who come after us so that they can build on the foundation we lay. If we just get stuck on what's been done and we don't lay the groundwork for a wise policy, the future generations will have the same kind of problems and maybe just want to rename. So we want to consider what are the things that are important to put in place in a sense of a policy that can guide us in future, or maybe in changing some of the policies that we have that can help us when we consider naming and renaming in the future. Look, there is no doubt that names matter. In fact, names matter a lot. I've been thinking back at the history of our country, how names have changed, how many people of all races have felt angry, disadvantaged, excluded, and otherwise by the renaming of the places they grew up in, the schools they went to, the universities they studied at. In fact, I myself been thinking about my own history, that the many names or spaces that I occupied, actually the majority of them have changed. The name of the place I was born at has changed. Well, maybe not just changed. The place itself was decimated. It doesn't exist anymore. I went to 7 schools in my 12 years of basic education. And 4 of the 7 schools I went to in basic education have changed their names for one reason or the other. I went to 2 universities in all my studies, and one of the 2 universities I went to has also changed its name. I've been thinking a lot about how does name changing affect a society, affect a group of people, but also affect individuals. How has it affected me and how I relate to the schools, the universities, and even the place that I was born at that doesn't exist, that we pass on the freeway and my mother says that's where it used to be. If truth be told, my relationship with Wits University is much closer than my relationship with Northwest University, which was a different name when I went to it. And it is only recently that I have come to make peace with the changed name of my first university and stopped complaining about how the current university is not as good as my former one, how my former university with its name, how the curriculum was configured, and how it educated us for a wider world. I have stopped complaining about that and made peace with it, but I know how it feels when the name of your university changes and you feel like you don't belong to it anymore. So when I read the emails of colleagues of our community who've been to UCT, who feel uncomfortable, who are angry, I understand when they are angry about the name changes, because there is an attachment to the name. There is a history to the name. There are experiences to the name. There's a feeling to the name. There's a connection, there's a community to the name. And somehow when the name changes, one feels like you're losing the community. You feel like you're losing that history. And I think there is something that I want you to know that I recognize very well, because one has been through it many, many times. But we need to keep in mind that removing someone's name from a building does not in and of itself indicate our departure from history, our desire to change history, or even our transformational growth. I think anyone who thinks that moving a name of someone from a building means our transformational growth is misguided. We live in a society that is constantly changing. Today's heroes may not seem heroic to our grandchildren 40 years from now. The discussion about renaming of any building, therefore, should not be about polarizing our views or intimidating the other into a decision. And I've said this to students as well. It's not about who wins, who loses, who whatever. That will not serve any good purpose, not for the individuals, not for the university, either now or in future. A name can carry strong emotions for different people, as I explained. For some, the emotions are warm and positive, while they may be alienating for others. So these conversations about naming and renaming are often uncomfortable. But if we are to forge a community that is inclusive and truly celebrates our diversity, we have to make the most of the opportunity to consult with each other about what our values are and how we commit to making those values take shape in the UCT community. So this is a time, in my view, for finding common ground, even if we begin by sitting on opposite sides of the issue. At some stage, we've got to come together and say, how do we come together? What is it that we believe in? What is the name that can take us forward? I think we may even need to consider a possibility that in 20 years, whichever name we choose for this building or for this residence, for example, for Smarts Hall, may no longer be relevant for the new students who will come after us. And perhaps we need a policy that encourages us to reconsider the names of UCT buildings every 2 decades. So no building is considered to be named in perpetuity. Perhaps a policy that does not try to erase our shared past, but makes room for us to consider how far we have come and what future we want to build. And we have to be open to this fresh way of looking at how we create communities. Perhaps we need to have a conversation about whether naming buildings after politicians is a good way to go, or political identities, or people who are involved in political movements and government. We've got to consider, or even just naming after human beings. Should we be locating or naming buildings after things that symbolize our values, things that indicate who we are as a university? And those things are not always located in a human, that we have to give the name of a human being. It can be a name of something that indicates that value that we share. So I hope that in this conversation, we can consider some of these conversations, some of these complexities, and can also consider what it means to confront our history. Because, as I said, we have a really complex history. We've got moments of pride and moments of shame. We've got moments that bring us together, moments that pull us apart. If it were possible, we would wish that passed away and start afresh. Unfortunately, we can't, but we want our space at UCT to be an inclusive space. And one of those ways is through the names that are in the buildings. No doubt, our priority is the academic program, but that academic program happens in a space that has got names that are embedded in our history. And so we need to make sure that that is inclusive. I want to pause here and see if Malcolm is in the room, the chair of the Naming of Buildings Committee, because if he's in the room, I would like to hand over to him to explain some of the processes in terms of the Naming of Buildings Committee. Sydney is not, right? I've just looked there.
Malcolm. As far as I know, he's not yet. They're trying to get him on.
All right. Okay, so perhaps what we should do is to open for questions, and perhaps Sydney, you can take questions if there are questions. If there are no questions, we can go back to reading the ones that came. Oh, I see Deborah Hubert has got quite an interesting point, and she says, when a name is changed, is it possible to display a plaque stating the former name, the reason for change, and the reason for honoring the person whose name is currently in use? History is important, information is important. Would this not help? Deborah, I think that's a brilliant suggestion. I think it's a brilliant suggestion, and I think there are many places that do that. That consider that right, actually what the former name used to be, and it might not be possible to write everything about the reasons, but I think it's something to be considered. I don't know if any member of the executive wants to talk to that. Reno, do you want to talk to that?
Thank you, Vice Chancellor, for the question, and thank you to the alumni who asked it. I think it is important to record the name of the building, the reason. It becomes a matter of record, and therefore, even when we're not here, people who come and visit the campus have a deeper understanding of the history and the naming of the building. So I think that's a very good suggestion, and it is incumbent on the Properties and Services Department to do so, and it's something we will give more attention to. Thank you, Vice Chancellor.
Thanks, Reno. And perhaps it's not just only in the plaque, it's also in the history of the university, how the names change, because that's one of the things that we need to keep for future generations. Thanks very much, Reno. Sydney, do you want to select the questions? I'm trying to multitask, but actually it doesn't help. I see Malcolm has joined. Perhaps let's take 2 more questions and then we give Malcolm time.
Yeah, Khedi, so I don't know if he's on, whether you would like him just to give some input, because
yeah, I wanted us to take 1 or 2 questions.
Some questions. The first question that came in about how much of, perhaps the one was, are students being involved in the name changes or the discussion? And linked to that, will the meaning of names be communicated? That when we change names, will that be communicated? So that's sort of a related question. And somebody asked, how much weight do we attach to the various opinions when we take a decision? So it's broadly about the consultation process. I would guess that people are sort of asking questions about. I think you touched upon the display stating the former name, and there was an interesting question which is relevant, but it's also a slightly different subject, and that's the naming of buildings when it's attached to a donation rather than renaming buildings, for other purposes. So that's also an interesting question. So perhaps I'll just leave those few for the moment.
I suggest I'm just going to answer the one question and maybe say to Malcolm, I'm going to hand over to you after this and request that you take colleagues in the room today through a process of how the naming of buildings works, how the proposals come to the naming of buildings, how you move from proposals to deciding this is the building and until you get to council, so that members of alumni understand how that process works. Are students being involved? Students, just the answer to that, students have representation on the naming of buildings committee, and so they're involved through that route. The SRC nominates someone to represent them on the naming of buildings committee, and that's in terms of the decisions that are made. But in terms of moving from what we have, the name that's been changed to the new name, I'm sure Malcolm will explain how that process works. Of course, consultation and involvement of the UCT community is important. And the UCT community is not only students and staff currently, it is also the alumni, our donors, because you are the people who support us and root for the university when none of us are there. Malcolm, over to you.
Thanks, Katie, and hello to everybody. I'm sorry, I've just joined now, so I've missed all the earlier discussion, but I can try and respond to the question that Katie has asked me to respond to. I'm fairly new to the naming of building committee. I took over as chair about a year ago with the installation of the new council. So I haven't fully been involved in the process, so some of my inputs might be a bit thin. So the process when it comes to naming of the renaming of buildings is that normally there would be a proponent or protagonist would make a submission to the naming of buildings committee, requesting that we consider a name change. And we will then consider the name, whether we would pursue going through the process of renaming, and we would consult internally. Particularly important is consultation with the alumni department, because they deal with funders, and very often the name of a building is attached to a funding grant. So they would normally advise as to what kind of consultation is required with the funder or the donor. But once the naming of building committee agrees that we should take the process forward, then the process of consultation takes place with the range of stakeholders, both internal to the university and external. As Gertie mentioned, we consult with the alumni as well. An interesting fact with the renaming of the Smuts residence, the consultation process was conducted in 2016, and the most numerous responses we received were in fact from alumni. But apart from the various stakeholders, it's important that we consult with some of the key stakeholders within the university. One of the key ones obviously being the executive team, the others being the institutional forum, and then the SRC are also very, very important, make very critical inputs in terms of that. So the consultation process is essentially around whether there is support for a name change. And if there is support, then we will proceed with going to council and advising council that we are now commencing on the process of re-looking at the name of a particular building or space. And that is what we've just now done in the case of the renaming of Smuts residence. And once council has approved that, and we've motivated why we should change the name, and we've motivated what process we have gone through in terms of consultation, then we go out on a second round, which is to ask for proposals in terms of a new name. And we then receive those proposals, we consider them, we consult where necessary, and we then make a second recommendation to council in terms of the new name. So, Gertie, I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Malcolm. I think that does. So that helps also, Malcolm, in answering one of the questions that was posed about whether the SRC proposal was the only one sent to the NOBC, because you explained that this was done in 2016, the consultation, but the Smuts Hall already came in 2015 on the list of names to be changed. So it's not a new thing. Your committee was carrying on the work that started in 2015. So I hope the person who asked the question got the answer. So have you spoken about the new name, Malcolm? Is there going to be consultation in terms of the new name? Can the alumni hope for an engagement in terms of that? Can they send names or ideas?
Yeah, as I've said, there will be consultation. We will invite people to make suggestions in terms of names and to motivate why they are suggesting a particular name. So that is the process that we are now about to embark on.
All right. I see I don't know if you can answer this one. I don't have an answer for it. Someone says, in your experience, how involved are white colleagues and stakeholders in this process? Transformation, unfortunately, is often not driven enough by white staff. And I wanted to ask how white colleagues or alumni could be more proactive, supportive in aspects like renaming. My knowledge is that the naming of buildings committee is actually a very mixed committee. It's not a blacks only committee. Malcolm, do you want to tell us more about that?
Yeah, no, it is a very mixed committee. And again, if I use the Smuts example, the majority of respondents were white. And the majority of respondents were mainly alumni, and they were opposed to the name change. So there has been very good response from certain constituencies within the university. And we're concerned that amongst the other constituencies, amongst Black academics and students, response often is what we would like to see in terms of this kind of initiative.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. Perhaps just to say, I mean, transformation is not just the work of Black people. It's the work of white people as well, and we've got to do it together. So I want to invite the alumni in the room to send proposals so that it helps. I see more questions came. Does the NOBC keep a running tally of demographics of those who are memorialized through having buildings or venues, etc., bear their names? For example, how many white men, white women, black women, etc.? Do you do that, Malcolm?
Yeah, we keep a tally of all the names of buildings and spaces on the campus. There is a record of that. I think one should be able to access it through the UCT website. If not, I think we just need to ensure that that is the case. But it gives the details of when the renaming occurred, what the previous name was, and a little bit of a narrative around the particular name as well.
Thanks, Malcolm. Perhaps also to make the members of the alumni aware that not all buildings at UCT are named after people. Some of the names are not names of people, and of course that's why we need something that explains. Godikwago, as I understand, is not a name of a person, and I think that requires some. So in that case, you wouldn't have this is a name of a white person, this is a name of a black person. We don't think about it in that way. We think about it in terms of the agenda for diversity and inclusion on campus. So the other question says, this question I think is not necessarily from Malcolm, but it says, can the responses from Smarts Hall connected people be made public? I think here they are asking about whether the responses that we got from people to the name change, whether they can be made public. And then the other question, my questions about pre-2021 anti-smarts proposals and responses have not been answered. Please release at least a summary. I don't know what they mean by pre-21. Libu, do you know what they mean? Someone who shared this question?
No, but I can respond later. Let me look into it and come back to you, VC.
Thank you.
VC, just to also mention to everybody who's online that if we do not get to certain questions, we will collate those and make sure that they all get responded to. So I just wanted to make that point as well. We hope to get to all the questions, but should we not be able to do so, we will respond to all of the questions.
Yeah.
VC, there was an interesting question earlier on. I'm gonna just find it now.
It says, why not name the building for its function? For example, microbiology building.
No, it's a broader question. It says, how is the renaming of places and spaces, if at all, related to the redesigning of spaces and places at UCT? In other words, what work is UCT doing to transform the actual places and spaces to ensure they meet the needs of students, faculty, alumni, and community? And you recall this has come up in a previous discussion as to you can transform, give a new name, but the building looks the same. If you go inside, it still gives you a different vibe. So I thought that was an interesting question to respond to.
I'm going to ask Malcolm to help us with the response, because Malcolm also shares the UBNDC, and some of the discussions in the NOBC are about transforming spaces and not just naming. Malcolm?
Yeah, and I think it's very important that that we do not look at names in isolation, that we look at them relative to the complex of buildings they are associated with, and to the spaces that they define as well. So there's clearly a strong overlap between the work of the Naming of Buildings Committee and that of Property and Services. Property and Services have a subcommittee called the Design Review Committee, and they very much focused on the architectural and urban design aspects of the campus and how this is integrated. The Property and Services have also done what is called an integrated development framework for all the campuses, which highlights critical things in terms of implementing the vision, for instance, of the university. For instance, currently there's work around Vision 2030, and Property and Services is involved in unpacking in terms of what that means in terms of the spatial and physical aspects of the university. But the other very important committee that is part of the overlap is the Artworks Committee of the university, because not only do we need to look at how we configure spaces to be representative of the ethos and the vision of the university, but we also have to look at how this is represented. And that kind of input is very critical. If we are renaming a building, it's important that people know why the building has been renamed, that there's a narrative that is available within the foyer or outside the building that indicates if it's a figure, a person the building has been named after, that gives us some background to that person. So for instance, there's a building named after Neville Alexander, who many of you may know as a leading academic, and who's made a major contribution towards the whole issue of race, etc. But I mean, people could very easily think that it's named after someone from Alexander Forbes, So it's very, very important that we in our representation of renaming, that there is a narrative that is very clear, that future generations of students can understand where the renaming process has come from and why particular decisions were taken to rename particular buildings. So that's an area where a lot of collaboration, cooperation, a lot of debate is still needed, but it is work that has commenced, and I think we will start seeing positive results soon.
Thanks, Malcolm. Rena, can I ask that you help us respond to this one that talks about the fire and the renaming? So it says, can you please address the destruction of the places at UCT in the recent fire? What is being done to find the systemic causes of the failure? Who is taking responsibility for the disaster? What assurance is there that buildings newly renamed or not will remain standing?
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. In respect of the processes and transformation of spaces and places, I'll ask Martin Hall to speak to, because there is an ongoing project also in terms of the library, the Jagger Library and other buildings. And as far as the fire is concerned, it is immediately after the fire, we obviously concentrated on making sure that all the health and safety issues were dealt with, that the preventative work that we did before the fire continued after the fire. And certainly immediately after the fire, we worked very closely with our insurers, given that the insurers have set up and appointed an independent investigator to make sure that the fact finding is independent, that a report will be available, and that we work with our other stakeholders, namely Sandparks, the City of Cape Town, and other agencies in the city to ensure that all those issues that may have contributed to the fire are addressed. And we as an executive are wholly committed to make sure that that fact finding and all those findings are dealt with decisively. And it is our responsibility as the custodians of the university to implement what comes out of those findings, but also to recognize that we did a significant amount of work prior to the fire to make sure that there are, in the event of fires, limitations to the damage. Thanks, Vice Chancellor. I'll ask Professor Hall to speak to issues of transformation and the renaming and the working of the Jagger Library. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Reno. Just to add to what you've said, as you know, we started a process of consulting quite widely in the university on reimagining the central part of the upper campus, and this is an extension of the work of the Naming of Buildings Committee, which is responsible for naming places as well as buildings, and we are working under the direction of the Naming of Buildings Committee. But we want to bring in people in our architecture and planning department to help conceptualize some of the form these new buildings can take. We're obviously working very closely with our professional staff in the libraries. We are considering, in terms of safety, and this applies to significant scientific collections, because of course we also lost very important science materials in the Pearson building. We're considering whether, in terms of contemporary practice, it's appropriate for original archival material to actually be stored in a public place like a university building, because of course with the opportunities now of digitalization, a lot of major collections like UCT's are being stored in remote locations, and overwhelmingly scholarship is confined to digital replicas. So we're looking at all of those issues in the context of rebuilding and reconceptualizing. Back to you, Vice Chancellor.
Thanks, Martin. Looking at the names, at the questions. Malcolm, there's a question about the naming of buildings committee. Do you want to give names, perhaps, how the naming of buildings committee is constituted, the constituency that they represent, and yeah, and perhaps whatever the question says, also their professional backgrounds. I'm not sure if that's necessary given protection of personal information, but perhaps the constituencies that people represent and so on, whatever is possible. Malcolm, over to you.
Yeah, so the nominations onto the committee from council, and obviously it would include people who have a particular interest in this area of work. And that's how I got onto the committee. I'm one of two nominees from council. Then the Alumni Association also nominates a person. Sorry, I think it's the funders or donors. Ketty must help me out what the body is.
I can give you the different offices, right? Yeah. I can get that for you.
Okay, and then the Senate also nominates people, and then the SRC is the other party that nominates people. So it's quite a good mix of people that we nominated by various important constituencies, and then of course very importantly, the VC, the Vice Chancellor, also nominates somebody to serve on the committee. And historically, it has been the DVC for transformation and student affairs, and that currently is the acting DVC, Professor Martin Hall.
So thanks you, Malcolm. So the group that we're talking about is so there is one member of the administrative and support staff nominated by the Institutional Forum. There is one member of the non-professorial staff nominated by the representative of academic staff body, and 2 members of academic staff nominated by Senate, one of whom must be a professor. And then there's one one member nominated, member of convocation nominated by the Alumni Association Advisory Board. And then the president of convocation serves on the committee as well. And then the SRC has got representation. So it's quite a representative body. All right. And then there's a question, Malcolm, that says, how do we access the narratives of the old names and the process of naming that went into that? I think you have responded to that, though, that you did explain that we you know, the naming of buildings would like us to have a plug where there's an explanation so that people can explain. So we won't go into that again. And this one, maybe it's for us, it says, I haven't read all of it, says, South Africa needs to gender a culture of striving for excellence as opposed to current desire for mediocrity. We play a role in a global village and need to represent people that make it on the global stage, people that students can strive to be or emulate their success. I have to say I agree with you 100%. We live in a global world, and actually the challenges that we face currently, this challenge of naming and renaming is not unique to UCT. It is not something that UCT alone is grappling with. It is not unique to South Africa or even Africa. Universities across the world are battling with the contestations about history, because history is always complex. And all universities have to deal with it. I'm sure if you've been watching the media, you know the contestations that have started, or the findings that have emerged in Canada, and how they have led to conversations about statues and sometimes removals of statues. And as you can imagine, it will go to names as well. The issue of names have been an issue in the US. It's an issue in the UK. It's a worldwide issue, because the issue of history, inequality, and voice is an issue that affects all countries. And so it is not something that's unique to UCT. And it doesn't mean that we remove our eye from our academic project. We remain focused on the academic project. In fact, it might even ignite some passion for our students to study, to be more interested in our roots, where we come from. So our eye on the academic project is still sharp. We remain competitive, not only on the continent, but globally. Our students continue to go outside the country to pursue other interests, like all other students. So that focus is still there. The other question says, why are there no alumni nominees on the NOBC? It seems that it is heavily weighted to transient members without the stability of longer visions. Well, there are alumni. There are alumni, the president of convocation, and then another member that's nominated by the management, by the Alumni Advisory Board. So there's two representatives. Just like council has got 2 members, the alumni has got 2. Council has got 2 representatives. Alumni has got 2 representatives. Senate has got 2 representatives. So the alumni is very much represented in this regard. In fact, it could have even more representation, because it is possible that some people who are Senate, who are non-professional professorial staff, may also be members of the alumni. So there is representation there. And then there is, I don't know, someone is looking at the documents on the website. There's a question here that says, if General Smuts played a pivotal role in the World War, and he did that flying the South African flag high, why disposing of his name from our history? Whether his contribution was politically correct or not is neither here nor there, but we should append from that history as we move forward. I think I will ask any member of the exec who wants to talk to this. I mean, here's the point. I mean, history, as I said, is complex. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, Smuts has got a complex history, just like many other leaders who we might have had, who's, yeah, I mean, he's not like any other leader, but it's complex. So it depends which perspective you're looking at. People don't talk about the World War in the same way, depending on where they come from. So it is not so much about Smuts. It's not always about the name that we're removing. It's also about including other names. So the name of Smuts was felt not to be inclusive, and that is why it didn't win the vote to stay on. You know, there are communities that will find that Smuts is a hero, and in other places it's not. And that's just what it is. So I think what is important is to focus on what could it be, then what does Smuts Hall become, and is that name inclusive? Do we feel that it represents all of us, rather than you know, hang on to the name of Smuts and what he did when? So when the colleague says, well, it's neither here nor there, well, it is here nor there. The name of Smuts does evoke negative emotions for some people who are members of our community, and it's not a small group of people. And that's why it's important to confront that history. Complex, difficult as it is, we have to confront it as a university. And the thing that I think we should, maybe I can make you aware of is, I mean, the chair of council wrote about this, the fact that, I mean, it's the first time that we engage in something like this. If you remember, when the Statue of Rhodes went down, it wasn't a comfortable conversation. A council meeting was you know, gate crashed by student protesters who demanded that the statue be removed, and it wasn't comfortable. I think our university has grown. I think we have had a long journey. It is good to talk about difficult issues without burning buildings or art or confronting members of council in a violent manner. So we are here now as the new leadership of UCT, and we would like the university to come together, this process to bring us together rather than to divide us more.
Vice Chancellor?
Yep.
There was an earlier question which is interesting, and asking whether we have considered establishing a small section on campus where old names and even statues are kept with historical background, and you know, to give an opportunity for reflection on, you know, the history. So I thought that was an interesting question.
Yeah. It is an interesting question. I saw that, and I think it requires engagement because, as you know, space at UCT, our biggest challenge is space. Even our art, we don't have enough space to store the artworks that we have at the university. So you know, it's it's something to engage on. I don't think it's possible to give an answer now, but we do need a creative conversation about what happens. I mean, firstly, the history and what was needs to be written down, but the statues and whatever, I think they should be kept safe. There are many other ways of managing this, whether you keep them on campus or they get displayed elsewhere where it can be a comfortable place for them. There's many other possibilities, and I think it requires conversation within the university. Someone is asking whether the NOBC has got guidelines. That NOBC has got terms of reference, and perhaps we just have to make sure that an up-to-date copy of the terms of reference of the naming of buildings committee is online. Malcolm, if any member of the alumni wants to send their views to the NOBC, Can they do that?
Yes, they're most welcome to do that. I mean, just on the previous point, in terms of the terms of reference for the naming of building committee, it is currently under review. And we've in fact undertaken to submit a proposal for a revised terms of reference at the next council meeting in October. So certainly once the terms of reference has been posted and people would like to comment on it, I think they should address their comments to the registrar, who could then forward it to the committee.
Okay. So there's currently terms of reference online. People can start commenting on those. They may be a little old. They can comment on those and send to the registrar as they get discussed, I guess. All right. Okay, I don't see any more questions, Sydney. Shall I hand over to you and switch off my screen?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chancellor. I think we've answered most of the questions. As I said earlier, alumni, friends, colleagues, if we've missed any, we'll go through the list. If we've missed any questions, we'll make sure that we do respond to those who post the questions. And so from my side, on behalf of my department, the Development and Alumni Department, the Vice Chancellor, the other members of the executive, and to Malcolm, sort of many thanks for the questions, for listening to us, and I hope you appreciate the feedback you've received. These are difficult issues, but you can rest assured that we as a university tackle them with dedication and honesty. So thank you very much for participating. Just a reminder to also follow whatever we're doing at UCT through our various social media platforms. Stay engaged, and we always appreciate your commitments and your interest, and as the head of the development office, obviously your donations as well. So many thanks to my own team and also to the ICTS team for facilitating, and I wish you all a pleasant evening. Thanks for joining us. Good night.